Looking now at the race for Attorney General. The current Attorney General, Aaron Ford, is now running for governor. Joining us here is State Senate Majority Leader Nicole Cannizzaro. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
In what's turned out to be a bit of a somewhat crowded Democratic primary that's shaping up here. First of all, thanks again for joining us. Let's talk about why you've decided to make the move from the legislature to, hypothetically, the Attorney General's office.
So I'm running to become the Attorney General in order to make Nevada safer or stronger. I am a former prosecutor. I'm very focused on making sure that we are investing in and focused on public safety with the top law enforcement officer's job in the Attorney General's office. I have in the legislature been fighting for protecting Nevadans' rights, and so I'm going to be focused on ensuring that we are continuing to protect Nevadans' rights in the Attorney General's office. And of course also as a state legislator and as a mom facing the same economic challenges that all Nevada families are facing, I'm going to be very focused on making sure that we're creating the kind of economy that works for everyone and allows for Nevada families to get ahead.
So I want to talk about the Attorney General's office and the race in a second, but I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the legislative session a little bit, just to recap. Obviously, it ended kind of with a bit of a thud in the Senate, and you were there and right in the center of everything as it was going on, the Senate Majority Leader. How would you grade the end of the session, the way it went, the delays from the Republican senators, a lot of votes, a lot of bills, it just sort of died on the vine there. A grade on how the session ended?
I think it's tough to have a grade. I will say every session is unique. You know, I've been the state Senate Majority Leader now through 4 legislative sessions, and I think one of the biggest takeaways from this legislative session is that we did do a lot of really great work. And in the Senate, you know, we voted out all the bills that we had enough votes to move. We were very focused on helping to reduce healthcare costs, to expanding educational opportunities, and also making sure that we're putting in accountability measures and investing in education for students here in Nevada. And of course, we passed a number of bills, including my bill on AI-generated child pornography to crack down on offenders and make sure that we could go after them and keep kids safe online. And so there were a lot of really great, I think, policy wins from this legislative session. And unfortunately, at the end of sessions, sometimes things get contentious. And you saw that in the waning hours of the Senate floor session. Unfortunately, we had a lot of Republican senators who, you know, sort of slowed down some of the process. But on the Senate side, we moved all of our bills out and got our business done.
Just to clarify here, because I was in the room when it was going on, as obviously you were, the Republicans were upset about some last-minute committee selection measures that were put forward. What was the motivation behind that? They said it was last minute. They didn't see it coming. How last minute was it?
Well, I think that we always are talking about things in the last day of session. That's not unusual. Right. One of the changes that we made was to make sure that as we're passing laws and putting into those laws, the implementation of regulations and the ability for oversight and for accountability with those laws that we are passing, that we're actually able to get some of that done and we're able to enact those bills. And some of the things that I think have slowed us down in our process and have resulted in us not being able to really effectuate the laws that we're passing is our inability to kind of move things through the Legislative Commission. And so we changed some of the makeup there to more reflect the balance of the legislature itself, which all of our other interim committees do.
Just a final question on this, because I was there and I was watching. I could see the lieutenant governor standing in the hallway. It looked like he was sipping on a Coke or something. The Republicans obviously delayed and, for lack of a better word, filibustered before any votes could take place in that last-minute thrash. What was going through your mind as that was taking place?
For me, in the legislative process, there's always room for disagreement. There's always room to say that we aren't going to vote for something. That always occurs, right? We have votes that are not always unanimous. That is something that we should be able to do without slowing down intentionally and stalling the process. And one of the things you saw the lieutenant governor do was disappear from the floor of the Senate and then wander out into the hallways. And he was, sipping on a beverage and walking around instead of coming to his post, which he's constitutionally obligated to be at, and somehow claiming that he was just locked out of the process. When he knew that we had just a little bit more time, we were supposed to be on the floor. The bell for the Senate to begin had already rung, well in advance. It was his job to be on the floor of that Senate, and he neglected his job.
Now, the session, it's over now, obviously, but it does bring up a point. The last couple of legislative sessions have ended in this sort of acrimony, it seems like, in the Senate side specifically. If you're elected as Attorney General, you're going to have to work with the other side of the aisle again, and quite a bit more in a statewide office. What does it say about the fact that as Senate Majority Leader, we've had these sessions end this way the last couple of sessions, and what impact does it have on your ability, maybe as Attorney General, to be the top law enforcement person in the state?
First and foremost, I would note that we have passed many pieces of legislation. Republican-sponsored bills, Democratic-sponsored bills. I have had legislation that has not only passed with bipartisan support out of both chambers of the Nevada legislature, but also has been signed by Governor Lombardo. This last legislative session, in fact, the governor and I worked on a very large education bill, and were able to get great consensus around that to really achieve, I think, some of the goals that we've seen from families here in Nevada. And that's always going to be my focus as Attorney General. I am somebody who definitely does not back down from fights. I've been fighting for a number of different things at the state legislature, including reproductive rights. And I am somebody who is the only candidate in this race, who has been fighting for reproductive rights at a state level. I will continue to do just that as Attorney General. And I think the other part is, as Attorney General, you're the state's top law enforcement officer. I am also the only candidate, Democrat or Republican, who has any real law experience and who has any experience with law enforcement, having been a former prosecutor for nearly 11 years with the Clark County District Attorney's Office and for a long period there in the gang unit. So
I want to elaborate on that. Your time at the Clark County Prosecutor's Office, how, if you are elected, would you incorporate that experience into the Attorney General's office? It's obviously still law enforcement. It's a little bit of a different scope. How do they translate? How do they correlate?
They're absolutely something that I think gives me the unique qualifications for this job. I worked as a chief deputy district attorney and a prosecutor there at the Clark County District Attorney's Office for nearly 11 years. I worked in a large part of that time in the gang unit, taking on complex criminal cases, things like homicides, sexual assaults, robberies, racketeering, identity theft. The Attorney General needs to be someone who understands what it is to put together a case, and as the state's top law enforcement officer, having that law enforcement experience, I think, is critical.
One of the challenges on a statewide level with law enforcement, as you know, being in the legislature, is staffing in the Attorney General's office, gaming control, NSP, whatever the case would be. If you're elected as Attorney General, how would you try and address that?
So I would like to say that, as Senate Majority Leader, we have been working very diligently to take care of our wonderful state workers, including our state police officers, everyone who works in gaming control enforcement. And those are important jobs, right, that we have to be able and be willing to invest in. And the Attorney General's office, I think, really is a place for us to work hand in hand with those on-the-ground investigators, with those on-the-ground law enforcement officers. And again, I think that's part of why it's so important for the Attorney General to be someone who is ready to take on this job day one, right, who has experience in the courtroom, who has experience taking on tough cases, who has experience dealing with some of these complex criminal issues. And that, for me, is one of my, again, unique qualifications, being the only person in this race who has actual law enforcement experience and have worked with law enforcement in my career.
The current Attorney General has been one of many around the country who's been involved in a lot of litigation, whether it's against drug companies, recently a lot of legislation, or litigation, I should say, against the Trump administration. If you're elected, would you continue that trend? And what maybe would you want to target?
Yeah, so I think Attorney General Ford has done a great job of making sure that he's protecting Nevadans' rights. I, of course, would continue to make sure that that is a priority for me, and in fact is one of my goals as Attorney General. But of course, I bring my own perspective, right? I bring my perspective as a prosecutor for almost 11 years. I bring my perspective as a state senator, having worked in the state Senate for 10 years. And as a mom of 3 little boys, I bring that experience with me, and in the legislature, I have fought really hard for things like maternal health, for reproductive rights, for making sure that people can access health care, for ensuring that Nevada families have fair economic standards. And I think, one of the pieces of that I certainly bring to the table is that as a prosecutor, I worked on very complex, fraud crimes, racketeering crimes, and we know that Nevadans, they're struggling. They're struggling economically, and layer that on top of, things like scams and big corporations that might be taking advantage of them and making it just that much harder. You really need somebody who's going to go in and fight for those things, and I would make that part of my job as the Attorney General.
But just to follow up, would you pursue litigation as well against the federal government, Trump administration, on things like immigration? You were talking about reproductive rights, other executive orders, whatever the case may be that comes from the White House. If there's room for litigation in your mind, would you pursue it?
Absolutely. I mean, I've been a litigator my entire legal career, and that is something that I, number one, have the experience to do. And number two, I think is important for Nevadans, right? To continue to enforce their rights, to make sure that when the federal government is overstepping, and we've seen a lot of that, right? Cuts to healthcare. We just saw a huge cut to education funding here in our state that we are going to feel. Pre-K programs, after school programs, things that students are relying upon. And so I think it's incumbent to have an Attorney General who not only has been in tough fights and not only has the experience as a lawyer to do that kind of work, but somebody who is very invested and has a track record of fighting for people's rights.
Finally, you're not the only Democrat running for Attorney General right now. State Treasurer Zach Conine is also running as a Democrat, and so there's a primary on the horizon here. What makes you different than Mr. Conine?
The Attorney General's office is a very serious job, and I think we need somebody who is ready to do that job on day one. Again, I am the only candidate in this race, Democrat or Republican, who has any real law experience, who has any law enforcement experience, and who's ever tried a criminal case. I have the experience that is necessary to effectively do this job. I am going to be ready on day one to do it, and I think that sets me apart from anyone else in this race.
Just to follow up on that, obviously you and Mr. Conine, you're in this. There's the same Democratic circles. There's funds that need to be raised. There's endorsements to get. Looking ahead, how much of a dogfight are you looking ahead towards here, in a very important race?
I will say this, I am born and raised here in Nevada. I am a proud graduate of not only the University of Nevada, Reno, but also the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I am a proud graduate, I know we talked earlier, of Chaparral High School. I'm somebody who is not just invested in this race because of partisan politics and Democrats or Republicans. I'm invested in this race because I'm a Nevadan. I've lived here my whole entire life. And so I'm going to be acutely focused on making sure that that is the case that I'm making to all Nevada voters.
It'll be a very interesting race. Nicole Cannizzaro, the State Senate Majority Leader, thank you for coming in very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll talk again. Thanks.
Yeah.